is no stranger to this, I'll call it a pulpit lectern. He's spoken to us a number of times about a number of topics. We are so fortunate that he joined the Boulder County DA's office in 2018. We recruited him at that time, and then he was reelected in 2020. As we all know, he prosecuted the very high-profile case of the King Soopers shooter, who is now behind bars for life without a possibility for parole. And he's working on the case of the perpetrator of the Pearl Street tragedy, the event there where one woman died and about 10 or 12 other people were injured. Last year, I forwarded a Denver Post article to Michael, to which he responded. And the headline of this article was, "Record high 8 children killed in domestic violence incidents last year." A wake-up call. This was for the year 2024. And during that year, Colorado reported 24 domestic violence deaths, which included the 8 children. That was up 24% from the prior year, albeit down from the pandemic years of 21 and 22 when the numbers were plus 90. As disturbing as it is to hear about the deaths of parents, or the deaths of mothers, and most of the abusers in these cases are male, so we're talking primarily about mothers. I asked Michael, I said, I understand that Adams County and Larimer County have a couple of initiatives that are proving to be effective, and I'm wondering what we're doing in Boulder County. And he said, well, let me come and tell you about it. So, Michael Dougherty.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm honored to be back with you today, and I will say on the way in, I was chatting with Sandy just briefly about domestic violence, and she said she was looking forward to the talk, although it's not a uplifting topic. And that's a really good point, and that's fair. But I also think when it comes to the Rotary Club philosophy and mission, as well as how I'm hardwired as a person and as a prosecutor and leader, we take on things that are difficult and troubling, and we do our very best to make them better. That's why I'm always proud to be amongst this group, and I appreciate the time to talk to you today about domestic violence, what we're doing here in Boulder County. I will say one example that's very much on the forefront of my mind today is because of the commemoration, the 5-year mark of the King Soopers shooting is this Sunday. So with that in mind, when I think about efforts to reduce gun violence, I do want to highlight what this club has just done recently and what TK and Constance and others continue to do, which is take proactive, positive steps to reduce gun violence. So you may recall that in the fall, the Rotary Club helped us put together a free gun safe giveaway where we gave out 500 gun safes in 21 minutes, which the importance of that is so many of the shootings we have in the metro area are with stolen guns. So for every gun safe we gave away, and I kid you not, the line stretched all around the Boulder Community Hospital parking lot, and it was one gun safe per person for their home or for their car, and people were lined up with their kids, people were lined up with strollers. We had about 100 people left when we ran out of gun safes. And we told them, come to our Longmont event on Veterans Day. And people showed up at the Longmont event. And we're gonna keep doing this, and I wanna see us take it statewide. We're the only jurisdiction in the state of Colorado that gives out gun safes for free to keep people safe and also to reduce the number of teen suicides. So when it comes to domestic violence, I'm going to talk with you today about some of the steps we've taken, positive steps to try to prevent and reduce domestic violence from happening, and then to enlist your help for a better future for Boulder County and for Colorado with us trying to develop a family justice center here in Boulder County. But I'm going to lay out the problem relatively quickly, and it starts with what's been happening this week. So on Wednesday, we had a teenager killed in Longmont by another teenager who lived in the home. And yesterday we got a guilty verdict on a domestic violence homicide that was committed in 2024. And the person was found guilty of first-degree murder yesterday afternoon and sentenced to life without the possibility of parole because of the work of my prosecution team and the sheriff's office on that case. That's just in the last 2 days. So Boulder County is a safe and wonderful place to live and work. It really is when you look at the data or when you walk down the street. But no community is immune from domestic violence. And that is true all throughout the United States. So there are a number of steps we've taken in Boulder County. I started the Domestic Violence Acute Response Team that I'll talk about, a Lethality Assessment Protocol, which I'm really excited to give you an update on, and then the Family Justice Center that I want to see us start here in Boulder County because it will greatly reduce the number of domestic violence homicides we have here in Boulder County and also prevent domestic violence from happening in the future. So here's part of the challenge with domestic violence is that roughly 80% of domestic violence victims nationwide recant or minimize what has happened in a domestic violence incident. That happens year after year after year all across the United States. So think about that as one of the pillars of our problem, that victims, especially as time goes on, will begin to recant. So one example I have from many years ago from my own career, as you know, I was at the Manhattan DA's office. I had a case where a couple had gotten into a fight in their kitchen, and the defendant took out a razor blade and cut the victim across the face many times. She was cooperative for the first month or so of the prosecution, and then she came into my office to tell me that she had actually fallen through a glass table in the living room, and the defendant had not cut her at all. And I was showing her pictures of the glass table from the crime scene photos, where it was not at all broken. Like, this table's not even broken. She's like, oh, it broke after the police took the photos. I'm like, well, how would that make any sense? The police arrived after you'd been slashed. She ended up testifying for the defense at trial. That speaks to the challenge we have in these cases, and it's partly due to the fact that these are all reasons, and it's complex, but some of it, I think anyone would understand that as time goes on, if I ask you to think about the last, and hopefully it wasn't a domestic violence incident, but just think about the last argument you had with a loved one, how you felt in the moments after or the hours after, and then how you felt 6 months after. So the passage of time as a case goes through the justice system presents one level of difficulty, because emotions can change, diminishing effects of trauma. Also, people feel like a loss of control, and it impacts their life, their livelihood, their ability to care for their kids, their ability to pay for rent, pay the mortgage, what have you. All these factors are the complex dynamics we see in the cycle of domestic violence. Sorry. Oh. So in Boulder County, here's the challenge we have. We have 8,000 cases per year that come through my office, just total cases, 8,000, traffic, misdemeanor, and felony. In Boulder County and all throughout the country, the number of domestic violence cases and child abuse cases is a significant percentage of our caseload. So over 1,000 domestic violence cases every year, roughly 350 child abuse cases every year. And we ask our prosecutors and law enforcement to do almost the impossible, which is predict which one of these is going to become something even worse. Which one of these may result in a fatality, ultimately. That's been the challenge in every DA's office across the United States. And we have to recognize the long-term impacts on kids, families, and community members. And some of the domestic violence research that we look at and the data that we have shows that the impacts are even greater in rural counties in Colorado, and they have a disproportionately higher rate of domestic violence fatalities. But we have domestic violence murders throughout the state, and we see these homicides happening at a higher rate in domestic violence situations than homicides generally. So murders have come way down in the state of Colorado over the last couple of years, and that's great news for the community. But domestic violence-related homicides have gone up. So when we look at that rise, I think we have to look carefully at what we're doing to prevent domestic violence from happening, and then how we respond. And that response has to include limiting any future acts of domestic violence, including homicides. And we should just never accept this as the norm. We should never say, well, we're going to have a certain number of these every year. I think the reality is that these are difficult to predict, but not impossible to prevent. So we'll talk about some of the things we can do. First, I want to highlight some of the data around the homicides. This was from 2024. We had 54 domestic violence-related fatalities in the state of Colorado. 38 were intimate partner victims, 26 were the perpetrators themselves, and then 8, and what's defined by law as collateral victims. I don't love that term, quite frankly, but collateral victims include kids and law enforcement or other first responders. So in 2024, all 8 of the collateral victims were kids aged 3 months to 7 years. We had a 24% increase in domestic violence fatality victims, and this is what prompted Constance to reach out to me, as homicides were declining by 16.7%. So domestic violence homicides have been going up every year while homicides overall have gone down. Boulder County, we had 2 domestic violence-related homicides in 2024. One of those we just got the guilty verdict and life sentence on yesterday. I will say, for what it's worth, both of those domestic violence homicides in 2024 here in Boulder County were cases involving people from outside our jurisdiction. So one, the offender came here, and forgive me for being direct, but came here to dispose of the victim's body. And another, he came here to kill the victim in Boulder County so that he was hoping it could not be traced back to him. But there have been 7 total domestic violence-related homicides in Boulder County from 2020 through 2024. So no community is immune from domestic violence. This is just a map of domestic violence incidents, not murders, incidents from January through June, 6 months, 2022 in Boulder. This map is concerning for 2 reasons. First, the number of blue pins. Second, they're all over the place. This is not, oh, we have a gang issue down in Superior, so it's causing a certain spike in crime. This is every community in Boulder County, and this map is consistent with what you'd see all around the United States. So we can do a number of things. One of the things that I did was start the first domestic violence acute response team in the state of Colorado. The goal of this team is for members of the DA's office to work closely with law enforcement on every single domestic violence arrest that is made in Boulder County. So whether it's a misdemeanor or a felony, it's immediately reviewed by prosecutors and investigators in my office, and they begin prioritizing cases, trying to figure out, of those 1,000 plus cases, which one of these presents more risk than others. And they start reaching out to those victims as early as possible. Because remember that 80% recantation rate. So establishing stronger connections early on in the criminal justice process, learning more about the dynamics of the relationship and the history of violence that's gone on in the family. And as a result, we're able to have better support for victims, we're able to connect them with resources, and we have stronger cases to prosecute. Our DV-ART is our acronym for this, DV-ART. DV-ART team has traveled the entire state of Colorado and done presentations for law enforcement, treatment providers, and communities all around the state. I want to see this model taken statewide. It's been really successful. It's allowing us to do a better job in preventing domestic violence cases in the future and also responding to and prosecuting domestic violence cases brought into our office. The second thing we've done, and this is a very timely presentation for this one, is we worked to use a standardized risk assessment instrument. It's a 1-page form for law enforcement called the Lethality Assessment Protocol. They fill it out in Boulder County. All 9 agencies within Boulder County use it now. They fill it out to assess the risk of future violence, including and specifically lethality. So this is, we call it the LAP, Lethality Assessment Protocol. The LAP, as I said, is now used by every agency in Boulder County. The goal is threefold. First, to ask the victim questions to learn more about what risk they face for future death. I just testified on a bill that I'll tell you about in a moment, and the woman sitting next to me was a victim in Boulder County who said she had denied to herself the risk that she and her kids faced until law enforcement showed up and they were filling out the form in front of her and showed the form to her. So victims becoming aware of their own risk, the risk they face. And she testified to the legislature just a couple weeks ago that the risk that she saw on that 1-page form prompted her to take action, cooperate with law enforcement, and get her and her kids out of the home. We also are then able to connect the victim with community support, and we're fortunate in Boulder County to have SPAN and Safe Shelter of St. Vrain Valley, 2 great treatment providers for Boulder County, and they provide confidential treatment support, shelter, and resources to domestic violence victims. It's also helpful for law enforcement and prosecutors to have that form and realize at the end of it what level of risk is there for a future fatality. We now do that in every domestic violence case in Boulder County, and I'm very pleased to tell you it's now the basis of a bill that would require law enforcement statewide to use the LAP in responding to domestic violence incidents. And it's well on its way to passing, and I do believe this will be the law in the state of Colorado. So this is a good example, and our second example of taking a problem and trying to respond and address it and do what we can to take positive action. So the LAP is now hopefully going to be the law for the state of Colorado in the next few weeks. So what can we do in the future? A family justice center. So family justice centers are somewhat innovative, still relatively new, and there are approximately 150 of them around the United States of America. They have been shown to be the best practice approach, and the Department of Justice has studied them, but also the data from different family justice centers is really profound, and to me, a powerful indicator of what we need to do next in Boulder County. It's been done in a number of places. So in San Diego, after they set up their domestic violence family justice center, a 90% drop in domestic violence. 75% reduction in domestic violence homicides in Alameda County. 51% decrease in my home place of Brooklyn, New York, after they opened a family justice center. And it's for a number of reasons, and I'll go through what those reasons are and why we want to start one in Boulder County. These are where the family justice centers exist currently in the United States, and quite frankly, Boulder should be on this list. And that's what I want to see come out of our continuing efforts here. So let's think about a domestic violence victim named Jane. She's assaulted tonight in her home, and she calls 911. There's a number of things that she needs. She's going to go from medical treatment to UC Health Long Peak. She's going to go for a protection order, counseling. She's going to meet with a caseworker. She's going to file for divorce, perhaps. She's going to meet with the district attorney's office staff. Here's what she must do to do all those things. Oh, sorry, I left out law enforcement and forensic interviews of her children. All of these things are things she's going to have to do immediately following the domestic violence incident. And think about the trauma she's already suffering from and what she's been through, and all the needs she has to meet while still getting her kids to school, going to work, living her life, paying rent, figuring it all out. It's going to require so much, and to me, it's going to require too much. I'm going to go through these next slides really quickly in the interest of time, but I think just seeing them will capture my point. So let's say Jane required medical treatment. This is the Google map. She's going to go 15 miles. It's going to take 28 minutes, just drive time to get there. This is for the protection order. Again, she's on the road, 27 miles, 1 hour and 6 minutes, just drive time. Counseling, financial assistance, family law help to get the divorce. Following up with law enforcement. Law enforcement responds, and in the moments of crisis and them trying to deal with the emergency situation, there's going to be definitely a follow-up interview with Jane in this situation. Over an hour by public transportation, 18 minutes if she has a car, and that's not including the time for the interview. Meet with the district attorney. We have an office up in Longmont for victims in Longmont. Otherwise, she's coming down to the Justice Center. Forensic interview for the kids. In Boulder County, we're very fortunate to have Blue Sky Bridge, which does forensic independent interviews of kids in child abuse and domestic violence or sex assault situations and cases. She would have traveled over 145 miles to do those things. It would take over 4 hours just to travel. And by bus, it would take 9 hours. So think about what we're asking someone who's just been a victim of domestic violence to do to get the care, attention, treatment, and justice that she needs. So a family justice center is going to do a number of things, because a family justice center is going to put all these needs under one roof. I often think of a family justice center as a one-stop shop. We have all these agencies that I just touched on under one roof. That's why they opened one in Denver. That's why I helped to get one opened in Jeffco when I was the assistant DA, the number 2 at the district attorney's office in Jefferson County before having the honor of being elected. And these are the kinds of services that are provided in a family justice center. So for example, the Family Justice Center in Denver, when you go in, they have offices for counseling, medical care, they have a dentist who works out of there, they have all these different resources, job resources, housing, the list goes on. As a result, the victim doesn't have to travel all over the place. She can go somewhere where they have childcare available and have these services provided. Other than the building itself, which is significant, other than the building itself, it does not require any additional staff. You would be taking staff from each one of these organizations and agencies, including law enforcement and the DA's office, and have them working out of the Family Justice Center. So it's taking the people who the victim's traveling to and having them work out of one place. So the victim only has to travel to that one Family Justice Center for all the services and resources that she or he requires. A couple of things come as a result of that. First, just better support, better treatment, better care for the victim and the victim's kids. Also, stronger connection and more trust in the individuals that are providing those services and support. And that's why you see those dramatic reductions in domestic violence homicides in the earlier slide in San Diego, Alameda County, and in Brooklyn, New York, because you have stronger connections with victims, so they're not recanting at the same rate. They're not ghosting the prosecution or giving up on the justice system. They're putting up with the process because they're getting support all throughout, and they have more trust and a better connection throughout the criminal justice process. So we have them all under one roof. It minimizes the number of times also that she has to retell her story. This is something in law enforcement and the DA world that we've gotten much better at over the years, but it still happens, particularly in domestic violence cases, where a victim in domestic violence goes to law enforcement and tells his or her story, then goes to the DA's office, then goes to the hospital, then goes to the counselor, then goes to the child welfare services, each person saying, with compassion and concern, what happened? And let me tell my story again, which is re-traumatizing and takes up a ton of time. So if you have these resources under one roof, it goes a long way to doing justice for the victim. And also, no criminal case is actually required if she just needs services and treatment. So there's no contingency arrangement where you say, we'll continue to help you as long as you go forward with the prosecution. Ideally, that's what happens. I say that as a prosecutor because you want to see justice done. But that's not the solution for every victim and every family in every moment. So there's no requirement that they cooperate with the prosecution. And this Family Justice Center is available to them. It also allows easy access to all those other community service partners. So there's a number of things that we can do in Boulder County to set up a Family Justice Center. One is continue to encourage Boulder County to use some of their open office space post-pandemic. As you know, a lot of people did not go back to work. We did in the DA's office, but there are other county agencies that did not have to go back to working in person in their office to the same degree that others do. So it would be great to have Boulder County facility space. And again, other than the building, this does not cost that much because you already have the existing staff and resources. They're just relocated to a different area. If we're unable to get the cooperation of the 3 or possibly the 5 county commissioners, we could have a private organization or a private-public partnership where you have money donated or a building donated. So for example, in Denver, it's named after Rose Andom, because Rose Andom was a victim of domestic violence, and she was able to give $2 million to the establishment of the Rose Andom Center, the Family Justice Center in Denver. In Jeffco, it was a private-public partnership where donations were received by the 501c3 that the district attorney's office set up, and those donations were the foundation for getting the Family Justice Center location going, and it's called Porchlight. It's a beautiful center, has incredible success and great resources available for victims. So that private-public partnership would be really key in us moving forward if we are able to do so. So I wanted to share this with you because Constance had reached out to ask what we could do on domestic violence. What we're doing in terms of the domestic violence acute response team and also the Lethality Assessment Protocol are really groundbreaking efforts. I've been a prosecutor now for 30 years, and I've seen just the immediate success of these innovative approaches. But the Family Justice Center is the next thing we should do in Boulder County, and we should have these all around the state of Colorado. It's just the right thing to do for victims and the right thing to do for community safety. And when you think about the number of domestic violence fatalities going up and the collateral victims who are losing their lives as a result, we have to continue to push to do more. I don't think we should ever accept domestic violence as the norm. We should never just say these things just happen, it's the way it is. To me, that's the equivalent of giving up. It's also the exact opposite of how Rotarians roll, so I think I'm in a room where people would understand that. But it's about taking something that's a problem and saying, how can we approach this differently? How do we build stronger connections? And those connections then lead to the prevention and better prosecution of domestic violence cases in the long run. So I'll stop there. Happy to take any questions you have. Thank you so much, everyone.
I'm going to start at the front. Thank you. Michael, do you envision navigators to help guide through all the wraparound services?
Yes, so navigators would be key to the Family Justice Center and having someone to help individuals connect to the services that they need, and that's why having them under one roof really requires someone to help marshal the resources, but also connect victims to the resources they need. So yes, definitely.
So Michael, this is absolutely amazing, and you're absolutely right, we need to have this. But I guess my question is, in terms of this is wonderful for the victims, but we obviously, again, it's mostly males. What is done or what can be done to try to change the behavior of somebody that is acting inappropriately towards a spouse or whatever? And if it's early enough in the process, can we actually change those behaviors and, again, just eliminate cases?
So good question. So first, I view it as a matter of power and control. That's what usually drives acts of domestic violence. So it starts at an early age and starts with kids and helping them recognize what we accept as a culture and what we expect from them in interpersonal, interfamily dynamics, and making sure that domestic violence is not accepted and that we teach kids how to resolve conflict and how to exercise or conduct relationships without violence, threats, and harassment. So I think part of it's education. Part of it also is the rule of law being enforced, because you set a certain baseline for what's going to be accepted. So for example, in the 50s and 60s, for example, law enforcement would show up and tell people in domestic violence situations, okay, knock it off, and then go on their way. And we would see so many fatalities as a result of law enforcement leaving. So now Colorado and most states in the country have what is called mandatory arrests on domestic violence incidents. If there's probable cause, the officer does not have discretion. Unlike if you get if you get pulled over on the side of the road and the officer says, you know what, I'm just going to give you a warning. They're not allowed to do that in domestic violence. So it's about the law having some baseline. It's also something I started, I'm glad you asked this question. 2 years ago, I started a domestic violence diversion program in my office for really low-level domestic violence cases, low-level meaning like phone harassment, like ex-husband, for example, calling ex-spouse over and over and over again. Getting him into a program, getting treatment to make sure he doesn't come back to the justice system. But for anything that's a violation of the criminal law, making sure that the consequences are such that people recognize that this conduct is not going to be accepted.
Thank you. Thank you, that was wonderful. I have 2 questions. The first is related to the training that the police officers have around domestic violence, and if you include social workers on those calls to help with motivational interviewing and also providing resources in real time. And then the second is about increased bail or increased sentences so that someone isn't arrested and then they're free within 24 hours and back to the home and angry about being arrested initially?
So good questions, and I have a lot to say about both. I'm going to try to condense them. So on the law enforcement training, this remains a work in progress. And I say that because often law enforcement officers are coming fresh out of college or high school, and we have to make sure that they have adequate training, and the training actually comes from the Attorney General's office. Every law enforcement officer in the state of Colorado starts their career by going through an academy, and whether it's for Boulder County Sheriff's Office, Durango Police Department, Sterling Police Department, the training is all the same, and it comes from the Attorney General's office. That training has to include domestic violence response and identifying who is the primary aggressor. And you asked that question, I think, for that reason, which is how many times do we see victims being arrested? So we look really closely at our data. So for example, just to put it in simple terms in the interest of time, I'm always looking at our data around how many women are being arrested for domestic violence, and then how many cases are being dismissed involving women who are arrested. Because if you just had cases of women being arrested and then convicted, I would say, okay, then that was seemingly the right outcome. If it's arrest, dismiss, arrest, dismiss, arrest, dismiss, you realize that you have a training issue for law enforcement that we're catching after the arrest has happened and after someone's been re-traumatized and not given the help they need. So that's a great question. The second question, and it's a question I've been asked a lot about this week, actually, because we had a decision I disagreed with that a judge made on bond on it wasn't domestic violence related, but it was an assault on an officer. So when a judge makes a decision on bond, it has to include the possibility of future harm to others in the community or the victim. Judges have to consider that. It's required by law. And there are times where judges, like anyone else, fail to do that adequately. And I think it's incumbent upon me to speak out when that happens. And we had a domestic violence homicide that happened in Boulder County. The trial's coming up, actually. It happened about 1.5 years ago. And I'm just going to share with you very directly. I go out on every homicide we have in Boulder County, meaning I go to the police department and then I go to the crime scene. So I arrived at the sheriff's office on the night of this homicide, and I open the computer and I start looking at the case notes, and I look to see if this person's had any prior arrest. And I'm reading 2 open cases with the case notes from our deputy DAs, and I realize this person should be alive today. Why is this guy not in custody? Because it was clear, given the increasing threats and the escalating conduct, that he was a danger. And in fact, one of our deputy DAs wrote in the case notes, trying to convince judge this guy is going to kill someone. I'm like, please. So I was very vocal about that, because as district attorney, I'm always going to stand and fight for what I believe is right and what justice requires. So it's about making sure that those bond arguments are made properly by prosecutors and that judges carefully evaluate decisions on bond. One area where we can improve as a state is under state law in Colorado, and I think all of us would agree, we don't want poor people incarcerated simply because they're poor. So you want to make sure the bond system works the way it should with that in mind. But under the law in Colorado, every defendant is presumed eligible for release, regardless of the charges. That's what the statute says. And the statute says with least restrictive conditions. So last year I went to the legislature along with other prosecutors from around the state and asked that the law be changed, that on violent offenses, judges should not be required to presume release. We didn't get that bill through, and we're going to try again this year. Thanks for the questions.
Well, thanks for speaking to us, Michael, and it's good to see you again. I always appreciate how you talk in practicalities, things we can do to improve, instead of just abstractions, so thank you. My question concerns what I would call physical abuse, and there are 2 other legs of this cancerous stool that's infecting the very fabric of our society, and that's emotional abuse and sexual abuse. And emotional abuse is very hard to touch, but how do we move with sexual abuse, the connection between that and physical abuse, and emotional abuse as a harbinger of what's to come?
So really good question. I think part of it goes back to what we're talking about in terms of education in schools, allowing people to focus on it, guest presenters and so on, and making sure we raise awareness around kids. And I think in Boulder County, we do a lot of that with Blue Sky Bridge. So if you have young kids, you know that in Boulder County, Blue Sky Bridge goes into the schools and does a lot of education presentations, and I think that's really good. In fact, the Dougherty twins are now 18, but my daughter will often say to her brother when he pushes her or something, or usually it's the other way around, but she'll say, "I'm the boss of my body," which is a Blue Sky Bridge quote that's cemented into her mind. But so it's education, but to your point, I think it's a great question. On sex abuse, it's making sure that victims know they're going to be supported if they come forward. That we're going to start by believing instead of looking for holes or flaws, so to speak, in their account. And making sure that victims know that prosecutors are going to fight for justice if we have sufficient evidence. And that law enforcement has specially dedicated investigators. And our DA's office has specially dedicated prosecutors. And I just tried a case this past December, because I believe if you're going to be a leader, you should still do the work yourself. And I just tried a case involving a fire department captain who used his power and authority to sexually assault 5 women, including a high school intern who was 17, through the fire department. And I just prosecuted that case, and he was just sentenced to 55 years to life a couple weeks ago. That was the absolute right outcome, but it's because of the courage and strength of those victims, and you hope it has a ripple effect, and that victims know that they can come forward when they've been sexually abused, and that help's going to be provided.
Michael, first I want to express my hope that when your day job is in Denver rather than Boulder, you will continue to give us these wonderful updates.
Definitely. Thank you.
But my question is this: the 5-year recidivism rate nationally is 80%. That's for all crimes. And what is it in Boulder, and what is it specifically if it's broken out on domestic violence cases?
So good question. And the recidivism rate in the state of Colorado for people being released from state prison, as some of you in the room will recall, is too high. And you'll recall, I think the Rotary Club invited Breakthrough to come in, was the name of the organization. And that was a pretty incredible presentation and great work by Rotarians in supporting Breakthrough. Because in Colorado, we have roughly 1/3 of people being released from state prison back in state prison within 3 years. And that's an absolute failure from my perspective. I mean, if I told you a third of the people were going to get sick from food poisoning from today's lunch, you probably would not have taken lunch. So a third of the people getting out of state prison being back in state prison within 3 years, we're failing them and we're failing community safety. On our restorative justice and diversion programs that we have in my office, we have an 8% recidivism rate, 92% success rate. We need to push more resources towards that kind of addressing of underlying needs and reduce the likelihood that people are going to return to the justice system. Obviously, the level of offense, the willingness to accept responsibility, what the sentence is, those all factor into it. But we need to continue working on the recidivism rate in Colorado, and I'm deeply committed to it.
Thank you very much. I was wondering if you ever sleep?
Yes.
Yeah, well, once in a while, all right?
Not a lot, but.
You mentioned an increase in rural domestic violence earlier. As a psychologist, I was asked to go, it was a few years ago, to present education for trauma. And there were 10 police representatives from these rural areas that came to this. Not one of them wanted to have the education. Can you respond about that?
So I do believe, well, they should have, first of all. But I do believe in rural Colorado they have different challenges than we do in the metro area. And we have to recognize that their resources are not the same. So there are jurisdictions in Colorado where a law enforcement officer, a sheriff's deputy, will have to drive 45 minutes by himself or herself in response to a domestic violence incident. So first thing about the fact that it's taking 45 minutes for the officer to get there. Second, the officer is responding by herself or himself. So those dynamics are really difficult in rural Colorado, and I think we have to do a better job of supporting rural communities and making sure they have resources in place. So for example, with the Lethality Assessment Protocol, in the law that we're hoping to get passed, it includes that law enforcement has to connect the person to the treatment providers. In rural Colorado, the feedback to me, or the questions for me were, what if we don't have treatment providers? Are we going to be in violation of the law? That's their reality. And just in Boulder County, we have 2 that are amazing, and probably more. But SPAN and Safe Shelter are in Boulder County alone. And rural Colorado has different challenges. And I've seen those firsthand. I was the head of the criminal section for the Attorney General's office and handled cases all around the state of Colorado. And since becoming district attorney, I've been committed to helping smaller jurisdictions when they call for assistance. So 3 years ago, I went and lived myself in Durango for the month of July, and I tried a homicide trial involving a 12-year-old boy who was the victim, because that office called for help because they didn't have the staff or resources to handle it. Fast forward a year, the judge calls me on my cell phone, which, by the way, this is not supposed to happen. But after the trial, the judge called me and said, Mr. Dougherty, we have a domestic violence homicide down here. I need you to come back down. I'm like, so Judge, we can't do it this way, but what is happening? And the DA's office didn't have the staff or resources to do it, so I didn't go myself. 2 prosecutors in my office, these 2 amazing women who specialize in domestic violence cases, they went down and they tried that case back down in the La Plata County area, because those jurisdictions can really struggle with resources, and that's why you need an office or officers that are going to help non-metro jurisdictions with the kind of things you just talked about.
We have another question in the room, but we just want to make sure you're okay with time.
I'm okay with time if Constance tells me I'm okay with time.
I'm good.
Whoever's in charge of the time, sorry.
This is a domestic violence case recently in the newspaper. A brother was arrested on the death of his brother. Could you comment on that? You may not want to, but is that a common occurrence?
Are you talking about the case from this week, sir?
Yes.
Yes, so that is the case I referenced at the start of the presentation. Since it just happened, I'm not going to get into too much detail. I will share with you, though, that the Longmont Police Department and other first responders did exactly what they should do, which was brought a really strong, immediate response. And they have outstanding investigators at the Longmont Police Department, and I appreciate all the work they're doing. And I also will tell you that I could see the emotional toll it has on them when one young person is charged with taking the life of another young person. So the case is just getting underway. We have 2 of our best prosecutors on the case. I was up there at the Longmont Police Department with them yesterday for a briefing on it. So we're still in the very early stages. But when you have a case where the person charged with the murder is 16 years old, obviously there's a need to collect a lot of information, and I don't have all the answers yet about where they get the gun, how this happened, what was the history. All of that's going to be worked on, and then we'll definitely have more answers as we go forward. And it does happen all too often, yes. In fact, former Sheriff Joe Pelly, who you just honored here a few weeks ago, once said, "You're safe in Boulder County if you're safe in your home," meaning that so much of the violence Joe has seen throughout his career is in one's own home. And that's why this topic, this presentation, and these steps are so important. Thank you for the question. Oh.
Michael and I are new best friends. We see each other all the time, and it's always a joy and a delight, but also a great honor to have Michael as our leader, not only in Boulder and Boulder County, but throughout the state. And this presentation really shows the distressing and very worrisome situation, but also how lucky we are to have such quality leadership that is both informed and informative to help us all deal with domestic violence. So, Michael, we're very, very honored to have you here. And as you know, the 100 doses of polio will be given in your name. Vaccine. Right. Right. Solve the problem, Leslie. Don't create one. Okay. So thank you, Michael, for joining us.
Thank you all. It's my honor. Thank you.